Naturally, my first thought was whether I would be able to make arrangements to attend. I looked at the calendar and based on the conference dates, was disappointed to see that it was apparently on a Wednesday and Thursday. I immediately thought to myself, why in the world would they have it in the middle of the week instead of the weekend? I was involved in the monastery school as a teacher and coach and also taking theology classes at the Aquinas Institute, which would make it impossible to get away at midweek, so I put the idea of attending the conference out of my mind. I did, however, keep checking the media to see if there was any publicity about the conference, but I was disappointed that I couldn't find a single notice. I learned that the speakers included blood expert Dr. Alan Adler, physicist Dr. John Jackson, physicist Dr. Eric Jumper, archaeologist Paul Maloney, physician Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, as well as two skeptics, microscopist Dr. Walter McCrone and investigator Joe Nickel. On Sunday, February 9th, it occurred to me that February 16th, the second day of the conference, would also be a Sunday. That meant the conference was a Saturday and Sunday. And I thought to myself, why did I think it was going to be on a Wednesday and Thursday? I looked at a calendar and realized I had originally, and quite mistakenly, looked at January instead of February. I immediately considered going again, but then quickly realized that it was less than 1 week before the conference. I figured I probably wouldn't be able to get permission from Father Pryor, that's the superior of the monastery. The plane fare would be about $500 on short notice, and I was scheduled to coach a 7th grade basketball team on that Saturday. Also, one class at Aquinas Institute always had a paper due the Monday morning of each week, and if I attended the conference, there was no way I would be able to get the paper handed in on time. My heart immediately sank as I realized I undoubtedly wouldn't be able to go. After Mass that morning, a parishioner, Lucy McNamara, who knew I was interested in Shroud, came up to me and said, I heard there's going to be a Shroud conference in Pennsylvania. Are you going? I was astonished that she knew about it since I had been on the lookout for publicity and hadn't seen or heard anything. Here was a non-Shroudie who had heard something I hadn't. How did you hear about it? I inquired. I don't know, I saw it in some paper or something, she offhandedly replied. I told her about the barriers that stood in the way of my attending and said that I would have to settle for watching videotapes of the conference. Besides, I said, I'm not sure Father Pryor would even let me go. Oh, but that's not like being at the conference, she said firmly. You ought to go. Where is Father Pryor? I'll ask him. I looked up, and to my amazement, he just happened to be walking straight toward us. Lucy stopped him on the spot and said, Father Pryor, there's a Shroud conference in Pennsylvania next weekend, and Brother Joe would like to go, but he's reluctant to ask him. But if you let him go, I'll pay for his plane ticket. He looked at me and asked what sort of school obligations I had. I told him, and he said, if it's okay with Father Finbar, who's the principal of the school, it's all right with me. I thanked Lucy profusely and eagerly waited to ask Father Finbar for his permission. At lunch, I related to Father Finbar the situation, and he also asked me about my school obligations. I mentioned the basketball game, and he said that if I could get Rick Suarez, a layman who was the other 7th grade basketball coach, to substitute for me, it was all right with him. That day happened to be the school's annual fundraising auction, so after lunch, I decided to go over the auction to roam around. When I arrived, the first person I ran into was Rick Suarez. I said, "Hey, Rick, just the person I need to see." I explained the situation and asked if he would be able to substitute for me. He answered with 3 beautiful words, "Sure, no problem." I now had permission to go. I had my plane fare paid for, and I had someone to substitute for me at the basketball game. There was still one obstacle left. I had a paper due for that theology class the day after the conference ended, and with travel and the busy conference schedule, there was no way I would have time to write it. I didn't know what I was going to do about the paper when I headed off to class on Monday morning, February 10th. When I got to class, the first thing the professor said was, "We've fallen behind in our schedule, so the paper that was due next Monday won't be due to the following Friday." I internally screamed with delight. Amazingly, the last barrier had fallen. At that point, I felt like I knew how the Israelites felt when the Red Sea parted. I was extremely excited knowing that on Friday night I would be headed to my first real Shroud conference. I had made arrangements to stay at the hotel where most of the speakers were booked so that I could get extra time to talk with them and also to be able to get a ride to the conference site. After so many things had happened to enable me to go, I assumed nothing would go wrong now. On Friday morning, February 14th, the day I was scheduled to leave, a huge snowstorm blanketed much of the Midwest and East Coast. I wasn't too worried, though, as I wasn't scheduled to fly out later in the evening when I presumed that travel conditions would have improved. In the late afternoon, I called the airline to confirm my departure time and expected no problems. To my horror, I discovered that my flight would not be leaving as scheduled. "There's no equipment," said the representative. "What do you mean there's no equipment?" I nervously asked. "The plane scheduled to fly out tonight was also the plane that was supposed to fly in this morning," he explained. "But because of the storm, the morning flight was canceled, so there's no plane to fly out tonight." I suddenly needed a plan B. I hurriedly tried to make other arrangements. I was told that I could take a flight out on Saturday morning to Harrisburg, but that would get me to the conference late. Or I could fly into Philadelphia late on Friday night, take a Greyhound bus to Harrisburg, take a cab to Elizabethtown before the start of the conference. I took the latter option. After a long plane flight, also delayed because of the weather, a Greyhound bus trip, and a cab to the hotel, I arrived blurry-eyed at 6:30 a.m., less than 3 hours before the start of the conference. I hoped to find a ride to the conference venue from one of the speakers, so I approached the front desk and nervously waited for the clerk to get off the phone. "Are John Jackson and Eric Jumper here yet?" I asked anxiously. He informed me that they had been delayed by the weather. "But," said the clerk, "Al Adler is here." "Great," I said. "Could you please let me know when you give him his wake-up call?" "Oh, that's who I'm speaking with," he replied. The clerk put me through to Adler's room, and I asked him if I could ride with him. Adler offered me the ride and told me to come to his room at 8:15 a.m. I breathed a sigh of relief. When I got there, he opened the door and immediately said, "I remember you." He was referring to when I attended his talk in St. Louis about 6 months prior. A friend of his actually drove, and we arrived safely at the conference just before 9 a.m. I virtually had not slept since early Friday morning, but I was running on adrenaline at that point. It was going to be a fascinating weekend. Shortly before the conference began, Jackson and Jumper arrived. Both had been young Air Force captains in the late 1970s when they co-founded STIRP. Jackson and Jumper were to STIRP what Lennon and McCartney were to the Beatles. I had been sending them my Shroud newsletter, but had neither corresponded nor talked with them on the phone. It was a real thrill to meet both of them. During the course of the conference, I also met Paul Maloney and Dr. Lavoie for the first time. I had corresponded and or talked previously on the phone with both of them. Dr. Walter McCrone was a microscopist who had made a name for himself by supposedly debunking the Vinland map, which was owned by Yale University and was purported to be a 15th century map that included information about the Norse exploration of America. I say supposedly because years later his conclusion would be contested by various other scientists. McCrone had been claiming since 1980 that the shroud was a painting and that the blood on the cloth was just an artist's pigment. When STIRP studied the cloth in 1978, their main objective was to discover how the image was formed. As a group, they concluded the image was not made by paint. STIRP's documenting photographer Barry Schwartz, when doing interviews, likes to ask how long one would expect a group of 24 top-notch scientists to find out that paint was the source of the image. Nickel, on the other hand, the other skeptic, claimed that the shroud was the result of a dust rubbing over a bas-relief statue. When Adler gave his talk on Saturday, he incorporated arguments to counter what he knew McCrone would say when he gave his talk on Sunday. Adler, whose specialty was blood chemistry, asserted that without a doubt there was real blood on the shroud. To this day, I still chuckle when I hear him say with a twinkle in his eye, "It's blood, B-L-U-D, blood." McCrone wasn't present for Adler's talk, leaving Nickel as the only skeptic there on Saturday. Adler could talk about the shroud for an hour and a half without taking a breath, and did. Adler also had the habit of constantly using the phrase, "in fact." when he spoke. Adler's friend who had driven us to the conference informed Adler after his talk that he, in fact, had used the phrase 27 times. There was a supper break in the late afternoon, and as is so often the case at Shroud conferences, people milled around during the break to continue to talk about the Shroud. When it began, I joined Adler, who was speaking with Jackson, Jumper, and Lavoie. After talking away most of the supper break, Adler suggested to the group that everyone get together to eat after the last presentation of the evening. Since I was with Adler's party, I was excited to realize that I was implicitly invited to go to dinner with them. As planned, after the last presentation, we met later at a nearby restaurant with no need to worry about getting back to the conference. I had to pinch myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. During the meal, many stirred matters were openly discussed. I suppose they figured a monk and a physician, Dr. Lavoie, could be trusted to keep confidences. When I retired for the night, it had been about 40 hours since I had any decent sleep. Despite that, I realized I didn't feel all that tired. It had turned out to be an exciting day as I expected, and I was still somewhat wound up, but I eventually descended into a restful slumber. Do I need to stop now for questions?
I think you should ask the questions.
Okay. I'm practically out of voice anyway, so when you don't do this much, your voice tends to go really quick. The book's available at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. It's probably best if you do a title search. If you go to the search box and put it wrapped up in the Shroud, in quotation marks, it'll pop right up. Any questions?